And the point that I'm making is that in everybody's life, at some point, there's a plan B. God is talking to us every step of the way. God is trying to show you something every step of the way. When things seem to be going wrong, that's God's way of opening another door. I am convinced that God has been directing me every step of my life.
On the Word Network.
Welcome to Nicholas Hood III Ministries, a ministry of hope, spiritual inspiration, personal power guided by Christian love. May the power of God's Holy Spirit fall upon you as you sit back and enjoy today's program. I introduce you now to Pastor Nicholas Hood III.
Today is the third in a series of sermons on the prophet Elijah, listening for the voice of God. If you've been following me the last several weeks, we'll see that Elijah has challenged King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. They have chased him. They put a contract out on him to kill him. He's running. He went once to a city called Sharif where there was fresh water. He was fed by birds. When the water dried up, he kept on moving. And he goes to a broom tree. And under the broom tree, he finds miraculously bread that has been baked for him and jars of water that are waiting for him. We're not told where this comes from, but I look at it and I say that is nothing but the hand of God. And then from there, Elijah keeps moving, and he goes on for 40 days, 40 nights, and he goes to a mountain called the Mountain of God at Horeb. And at Horeb, Elijah finds a cave. God doesn't direct him to the cave, at least we're not told that, but he finds a cave, he goes into the cave, and God finds him in the cave. And there's a lesson in that. You can run, and as Joe Lewis would say, but you cannot hide. And Elijah is ducking into the cave for security and safety and solace, a little peace and quiet. But God finds him there, and the voice of our God comes to him and says, Elijah, what are you doing here? And Elijah perks up, and God tells him, come out from the cave. And because God is getting ready to pass by. And, it's a little confusing because on one hand, you have God talking to him. On the other hand, we have God saying, the Lord is getting ready to pass by. But through it all, in faith, we find God. And so Elijah goes to the opening of the cave, and what does he see? The wind is blowing, and the wind is blowing so hard that it is cracking mountains right before his eyes. But God is not in the wind. Next, there's an earthquake. The earth is, tumbling, is crumbling, but God is not in the earthquake. Finally, there's a fire. And the text tells us, but the Lord was not in the fire. And I'm sure Elijah is wondering, if I've been told, by the Spirit that God is getting ready to pass by, I've witnessed, I've experienced the wind, I've experienced the earthquake, I've witnessed and experienced the fire, but God is not in all of that. What more could God expect me to see? And at that point, the text tells us that a small, still voice, he heard it. And when Elijah hears this small, still voice, he realizes this is where God is. I was looking for God up here, but God is actually down there. I was looking for God over there, but God is right here. And I couldn't hear God, I couldn't see God, I couldn't feel God because I was looking for something outrageous. I was looking for something overwhelming. And sometimes we do the same thing. Sometimes I believe we miss God because we're looking up high when really God is right here in front of us. We miss God sometimes because we're afraid of God. I think there are other times when we miss God because we already have a predetermined idea of what God is like, what God wants, and what God is doing. And because we had this predetermined idea of what God is like, it's hard to see God. And it's confusing and a little perplexing to Elijah that when he finally is up close with God, it is a small, still, silent voice. And I don't know if any of you have ever been in a place where it's really silent, but it can be sometimes overwhelming. In 1985, or maybe 86, I was made pastor of the church in 85. That's why I know that I think it was 1985. I was introduced to a woman and suggested by some leaders in my national church that I might consider hiring her to be an associate minister, the Reverend Dr. Pamela June Anderson. And the church, the national church, flew me out to Billings, Montana to meet her. We were not the only people there. There were a couple of other senior ministers who were invited to come in and to meet prospective associate ministers who were younger ministers. Actually, she's a little older than I am. We were both young at that time. I was only 34, turning 35 years of age. And so we went through a day's worth of meetings. And at the conclusion of these meetings, we were at the home of the president of a college there in Billings, Montana. And he looked at me and he said, "Would you like to take my car and drive to Yellowstone Park?" And I'd never been to Yellowstone Park as an adult. I think I went there as a child on a trip where my parents, took us out west. So I said, sure. And so Reverend Anderson and I got in the car, and I was told that Yellowstone was only 60 miles away, but what he didn't tell me was it's 60 miles going up, mountains. And so, you can go 60 miles, but if, you can't drive 60 miles an hour riding up a mountain, it's going to take you a while. And we started about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and about 4:30, we were just getting to the entrance of Yellowstone National Park. And when we're going up a mountain to get into Yellowstone, right at the entrance, and there at the entrance to Yellowstone Park, even though the windows were up in the car, I looked at Reverend Anderson and I said, boy, it seems really quiet here. And I said, I want to see what this really feels like. And so we pulled over, and it was one of the most desolate places I've ever been. Now, I've been on Mount Sinai. I've been in Toto in Ethiopia. I've been, I've been to Rocky Mountain Park, 12,000 feet above sea level. But going there into Yellowstone Park was different because the entrance that we went through was dry. It seemed desolate. There was no vegetation. And I said, I've got to see this for myself. So I pulled over, and when I got out of I rolled down the window, and I couldn't hear hardly anything. And so I got out of the car, and what I noticed was that I could hear the sounds of silence. Because even in silence, it was not totally silent. There were little animals scurrying around, but I couldn't see them. The wind was blowing. I could feel it, but I couldn't see it. And it really made me uncomfortable. And I kept thinking about myself. I was thinking about Elijah at that point. I said, I wonder if this is what Elijah felt like. I said, I'm here. I know I'm in the presence of the Lord, but I don't feel comfortable. I don't feel comfortable here. And I told the Reverend next to me, I said, I think I'm ready to go back. And we got back in the car and drove back to return the car to the owner. But the point that I'm making is that you can be in the presence of the Lord, but you can miss the Lord if you're not comfortable. You can be in the presence of the Lord, but if you're looking at the Lord up high and in a lofty kind of way, but you don't really get the full impact of hearing and feeling what God is saying to you, you miss God. And so I want you to think about in your lives, when have I listened to the voice of God? When have I heard the voice of God? When has God told me it was time to go or time to stay? When has God told me it's time to try a different profession? Has God told me that it's time to get a divorce? That it's time to stop getting beat up upside my head? Have you ever heard the voice of the Lord tell you, this is the woman you should marry, or this is the man that you should marry? Have you ever heard the voice of the God say, now is the time to invest, or now is the time to step back? And the point that I'm making, my friends, is you and I ought to be looking and listening and trying to learn from the voice of God every day. I look for God when I'm looking for a parking spot. I know that may sound silly, but when I'm in downtown Detroit and parking spots are few, I pray for a parking spot. And sometimes the spot is right in front of where I want to go. Other times, the parking spot can't be found. And in both instances, I talk to the Lord and I say, Jesus, are you trying to tell me something? But the point that I'm making is keep praying, folk. Keep praying, keep hoping, and keep loving. And realize that God will talk to you every stage and every day of your life. But you and I have to be like Elijah. We have to come out from the cave that hides us, so that we can receive God in a new way. Stick around. I'm going to be talking with Reverend Lawrence Rogers in just a minute after this break. And we're going to talk a little bit more about listening for the voice of God. Thank you so much.
This is a new ministry which is just starting. Reverend Hood needs your help in sharing the good news of Jesus Christ and His power throughout the world. If you would be so kind as to send a donation to Nicholas Hood III Ministries of any amount, Reverend Hood will send you a free complimentary copy of his book of original personal prayers and beautiful photographs entitled The Test, The Strength, The Endurance, and The Way Out.
I want to continue this dialogue on listening for the voice, listening to the voice of God. I have with me today Reverend Lawrence Rogers, pastor of the esteemed Second Baptist Church in downtown Detroit. And I appreciate so much you being with me these last 3 weeks. And give me your thoughts about Elijah coming out from the cave and trying to find God.
I think it's a very interesting story. Pastor Hood, let me just thank you so much for inviting me into your platform. And I really enjoyed having these conversations with you for the past 2 weeks. You know, I think it's a very interesting story. The story points out how Elijah was seeking these big things like earthquakes and winds and things like that to hear God's voice. And it reminds me of folks today. You know, maybe people watch too many action movies or sci-fi movies, you know, but a lot of folks look for these big, grand things to try to find God's voice. But oftentimes God talks to us through whispers, just like He spoke to Elijah through a whisper.
Mm-hmm. And the same with investing money. There's every week there's somebody who's investing their hard-earned money, their savings, in some scheme, you know, that promises to give you a much higher rate of return than what normally would be a reasonable rate of return. And then sometimes people get very disappointed when it just does not turn out, the way that they hoped. But by the same token, if you're investing your money in solid investments and you do it progressively and steadily, you find that when you come to your old age, you really have built up a nest egg.
Yes.
So, some people looking at today's program may not have, if this is their first time tuning in, they may not be aware of your book. But tell us about the Inward Revolution, and I believe you talk some about discernment.
Yes. So thank you so much for allowing me to talk about my book, The Inward Revolution, The Journey to Radical Transformation. And I believe discernment is a key part of that. In fact, the very first chapter is about discernment, and a great deal of this book is about learning how to listen to the voice of God, learning how to be able to distill our voice from God's voice, because sometimes we mix our voice with God's voice, and we tell ourselves things to do, and we say that was the voice of God. I think that's how we can find people who can somehow use God's name to support bigotry, racism, sexism, all sorts of hatred, to support wars. There's people who have used God's name to do all these things, and I don't think they were all disingenuous. I think some people genuinely thought that was the case, but the reason why they were so wrong was because they did not learn how to discern their voice from God's voice, and they took their hatreds and then tried to apply it to God, you see. And so it's important that we are able to discern and hear God's voice clearly, so that we can take our marching orders from God, not from ourselves and not from other folks who might have influenced us. And so my first chapter in this book is discernment, and it's all about learning how to actively listen to the voice of God so I can make decisions that are right with my Maker.
Give us one example or two of times when we just get the discernment wrong, and what can we do? What can the people looking at this show do to have a greater probability that what they are hearing is really God and not the voice of some fool or deranged person?
Exactly. Do you mind if I use a historical example?
Please.
I remember seeing a picture of a bunch of members of the Ku Klux Klan in white robes, and behind them, they were in a church, and behind them the sign said Jesus saves behind them. These are two historical examples.
And when they went to burn up somebody's house, often they would start with a burning cross.
With a burning cross, that's exactly right. And so, to your question, these are examples, and this happens because folks have not done the work of hearing God's voice. Now, one thing that we can do to not fall into that trap is take on a Christ-centric perspective. So get to know Jesus Christ. Study the words of Jesus. Study the Sermon on the Mount. Learn the nature of Jesus. And if something you think that you're being told to do by God does not line up with Jesus, because keep in mind, John 1 teaches us that Jesus is the Word. The Word became flesh. The divine logos became flesh. So the very Word of God is Jesus Christ. So if there's something that you think you're doing, which in the Nazis' case was genocide, of trying to commit genocide over people, that's clearly not something that Jesus wants you to do, because Jesus said the greatest commandment is to love God for our whole soul, mind, and strength, and the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. And the same goes for the Ku Klux Klan, who was practicing racial terrorism. Well, how can you do that when Jesus says love your neighbor as yourself? So if I'm taking on a Christ-centric lens, and I'm asking myself, I'm funneling what I think through the ethics, the will and way of Jesus Christ, and that can protect me from taking God's name in vain and misunderstanding my voice and thinking it's God's voice.
So I think that's very good advice, to start with what you've read and heard about Jesus in the Bible.
That's right.
Simply start with that and put whatever you're hearing or seeing or what somebody's proposing that you do through a simple test of, does this meet the test of the Bible?
That's right.
And then what about our personal prayer life when confronted with something that you suspect may not be right?
We got to pray. The Bible teaches us to pray without ceasing. We should pray all the time, multiple times a day. We should be praying to God. And I want to encourage us to not pray to God like God's a short order cook. Some of us know the greasy spoon restaurant you can go to. You sit down, the person comes and you say, what do you want? And I want a burger, I want fries, I want a Coke, I want pop, and give me extra chili on the fries. and then you expect the order cook to make everything to your exact specifications. That's how a lot of folks talk to God. God, I want this, I want that, I want this, do that, do this, do that, do that. Some people talk to God like God is their servant, rather than them the servant of God.
And if God is their short order cook, they may end up with a spiritual indigestion.
That's right. So I think it's better to pray to God like you would pray to a parent respectfully. Ask God, what do you think about how I'm living my life? God, are you pleased with my decisions? God, what would you have me to do? God. Ask God open-ended questions. Ask God for guidance. Ask God to give you the best way to raise your children, to help you figure out the best investments to make, to ask you what is God's wisdom for hard decisions at work. That's the way to talk to God, to go to God and ask him to show you the way that he wants you to live in your life. We have got to make sure we talk to God as we would talk to the Alpha and the Omega, the sovereign ruler of the universe and creation.
Pastor Rogers, if somebody's looking at this program and they're in prison, or they're a senior citizen who feels like they're in prison because of their infirmities, their lack of mobility, how do we encourage that person through their prayer life when they're praying for greater mobility, praying for a heart that's healthier, praying that they can get out of prison while they still have time left in their life, and it looks like the doors are not opening as fast as they would like? What encouragement do you give to that person?
Well, I would just tell them that first off, God doesn't see us for our infirmities. God sees us as a child of God. God doesn't see us as the world labels us, but God sees us as God's daughters and God's sons. And I want to be clear, and I'm so happy you asked this question. It's okay to ask God for healing. It's okay to ask God for restoration. It's okay to trust in God for those things to happen. It's okay to ask God to show you the way for what God wanted to have in your life. But I also think it's okay to remember that despite whatever condition you find yourself in, God can still use you. Keep in mind that Apostle Paul wrote a couple of his epistles right from prison. Absolutely. Keep in mind that John was a senior citizen when he wrote the Gospel of John, and even older when he wrote Revelation. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have seniors who were, you don't get more solitude than what John was in. And from John's being exiled to the island of Patmos and swapping scorpions off of himself, he writes Revelation, which had to have been a difficult book to write. So out of his isolation, he produced this great work that we have read for over 2,000 years. Mm-hmm. And so with that being said, I just want to point out that don't allow for your condition or your placement or your circumstance to make you think that God is limited. God is not limited by where you are or who you are, but God can use you despite wherever you find yourself, no matter how old you are or if you find yourself behind bars. God can still use you because God's done it before. We have many examples.
Pastor Rogers, we're about out of time, but thanks again, and thank you for bringing your book. It's entitled Inward Revolution.
Yes.
It's available on Amazon.
That's correct. Yes,
and if there are those of you who want to know more about this book, just go right on Amazon. Remember, it's Reverend Lawrence Rogers, and it's Inward Revolution. So thank you. Again, I really appreciate your being here. And I just want to say one more word. To those of you who are looking at this, I just want you to know that I really appreciate your consideration of supporting this ministry. This is a new ministry. I know you'll hear a lot of preachers talk about sow a seed. I don't care what image you use, but what I do want you to think about is if this program has been meaningful to you today, if you've gotten something out of the Word of God today, I'd like you to consider being a supporter of this ministry. If you don't belong to a church, it's okay. You can look at this as your church. If you do belong to a church, support your church. But I want you to know I'm really appreciative that you've taken the time out today to look at this. And you don't have to wait till Saturdays at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to look at my shows. You can look at it at any time of the day. If you just type my name in, Nicholas Hood III, or Nick Hood III, or Nick Hood Ministries, just Google that, and it will give you a link that will take you to all of my videos. I have a website called nicholashood3ministries.com. But if you just type in Nicholas Hood or Reverend Nick Hood, it'll take you there, and you can download the app, and then you can look at all of these videos. You can look at past shows. But I also want you to think about supporting this ministry. Again, I want to thank and I solicit your prayers for Ernest Perry in Vienna, Illinois, for Delgenia Barber right here in Detroit, who's been so supportive of this ministry, Jackie and Lorimer Wyatt, and Dr. Adanika Nunu, Renee Turner Bailey, attorney Rita White, Deborah McIntosh in Mobile, Alabama. I'm out of time and I can't read all these names, but Charles Johnson in the Bronx of New York, I thank you. Ethel, I think it's Hendrick, I thank you from the Bronx. And Phyllis Toney out there in Los Angeles, California, the land of the stars. I want you to know I'm praying for you, Phyllis. Phyllis is a new widow, and her husband was my good friend from high school, Kevin Toney, praying for you. Folks, we're out of time. God bless, God keep you, and remember, I'm praying for you. Hope to see you next week.
Thank you for watching today's program. We hope you've been blessed in a powerful way. Just knowing you took the time to watch today's broadcast is a great encouragement to Pastor Nick Hood. If this broadcast has been a blessing to you, we ask that you mail a tax-free donation to Nicholas Hood Ministries at 4535 Chrysler Drive, Detroit, Michigan, 48201.
You know why I really love Nick Hood as a minister? I watched his father do it, and he took over for the church, and he was one of us, but he really turned out to be a great minister. I know it's hard, and that's something that I know that all ministers may not be doing what they're doing because for the right reasons. But I know it's hard. I know he's a beautiful man, and we've been knowing each other for over 50 years. I believe in him. He's inspired me in so many ways to do what I'm doing and try to be the best at it. Make sure you watch Nick Hood's Ministries. You'll never be the same.
And the point that I'm making is that in everybody's life, at some point, there's a plan B. God is talking to us every step of the way. God is trying to show you something every step of the way. When things seem to be going wrong, that's God's way of opening another door. I am convinced that God has been directing me every step of my life.
On the Word